So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Oak Resiliency Assessment Tool workshop. My name is Logan Johnson, and I'm the Northeast Region Coordinator for the Forest Stewards Guild. I'm joined today by Christopher Riley, forester and conservationist with Sweet Birch Consulting, LLC, and Maddie Baroli of Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And today we're going to do an Oak Resiliency Assessment Tool workshop. Before we get started, I'll ask Maddie to launch a poll so we can see who's in the room with us. The questions we'll ask: where are you joining us from, and what role do you play in the world of forest and forestry? And while the poll is open, here's a quick overview of what we'll cover today. After this brief introduction, I will turn the mic over to Christopher Riley, who will provide a project overview of the Oak Resiliency in Southern New England project. We will then see a tool demonstration led by Maddie Baroli and look at an example tool run conducted by the Rhode Island Forest Conservators Organization, or RIFCO. After the demonstration example, you'll have an opportunity to test the tool on your own with an oak stand or forest you are familiar with, and the moderators will be on hand to answer questions you have at this point. And then after testing the tool, we will reconvene for a group discussion on how we can use the tool to increase oak resiliency in Southern New England. A quick note on CFE credits or continuing education. If you do require proof of continuing education credits, you can email me, logan@forestguild.org, for a copy of the certificate. We will upload the participant list to the Society of American Forestry System. So if you are an SAF member, back of your records for you. And I'm going to end the poll now and see who's in the room with us. So we have a few folks one folk from Connecticut, a couple from Massachusetts, 4 from Rhode Island, 1 from Northern New England, and everyone else is calling in from elsewhere. And then we're predominantly foresters and other natural resource professionals. So thank you for joining us today. Before I pass it on to Christopher, I just want to pause and acknowledge all of our partners in this project, from the tool development to the broader Increasing Oak Resiliency in Southern New England project. This is something I like to do for presentations to illustrate the number of partners need to accomplish projects like this one. So first, the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative developed the tool and will store the data we collect, while the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science provides scientific and technical expertise. The Forest Stewards Guild, with the help of Sweet Birch Consulting, LLC, is leading this Increasing Oak Resiliency in Southern New England landscape scale restoration project, which was a grant through the United States Forest Service. And we're working closely with partners from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island that include the Connecticut Forest and Park Association, Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, Yukon Extension, the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, MyMassCon Woods, Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation, Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, the Rhode Island Woodland Partnership, Providence Water, and the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. And with that, I will turn it over to Christopher Riley, who will provide a project overview.
Thanks, Logan. Well, we thought it would be helpful to give a brief overview of the larger initiative, of which the Oak Resiliency Assessment Tool is just one part. Before taking a deeper dive into that, some of you might wonder, why all the focus on oaks, since Southern New England, it's being Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, is after all a region that's known for its diversity of forest species, including the iconic white pine, our red maple swamps, and so forth. But it's important to recognize that fully 70% of the forests in this region are dominated by oaks. They're really a keystone species. And this forest type faces a lot of pressures. It's under stress due to things that compromise its long-term health and the ability of the forest type to regenerate itself. And some of these threats include deer herbivory due to the large deer populations that we see in the region, insect defoliation from pests such as Lamentia dispar, which was formerly known as the gypsy moth, the winter moth, other pests as well. Well, we've seen some tough seasonal droughts, and then climate change pressures as another compounding stressor. And then we've seen some parts of the region that have seen widespread canopy mortality, like that which you see in the upper slide, particularly in eastern Connecticut, western Rhode Island, up into central Massachusetts. And when you have areas of the forest that are affected so heavily, that can really impact wildlife species that depend on oaks for their food and habitat. It'll cause a safety hazard along roadsides, like the one stretching through that photo in residential neighborhoods. And then it could be a significant financial impact on woodland owners, many of whom have tended to and stewarded their oak forests over the years, only to see the loss of a lot of trees. And amidst all these threats, we have some classic silvicultural methods which were developed in the 20th century. They often worked well for decades, but now foresters are finding that they're failing to secure healthy oak regeneration. So we're finding that new approaches are needed. I might add that it's a challenging social environment to practice forestry sometimes as well, and it's one of the more urbanized regions of the country that has a lot of woods, and not everyone understands or supports reasons for practicing and promoting active forest stewardship. So to look at some of the different types of landowners in New England, you can see down in the part of the region that we're looking at the bottom of the screen, it is families and individuals who own most of the forest land. Again, 70% is the number. And, we have a lot of parcels of 40, 20 acres and even smaller. And so if you're going to effectively promote stewardship and changes in how we steward the land, that's going to depend on effective outreach and education to this group. And certainly landowners have a lot of different goals, from a place that's a woodland retreat to get away from the city and have some privacy, provide recreation for their families, maybe do fishing or hunting, or still some timber management. But given the ecological importance of oaks in this region's forest, all these management approaches stand to gain from integrating measures that are going to promote the long-term resilience of this forest type. So there are really four main goals to the larger initiative. At the end of the day, we do want to increase and expand activities on the ground that are going to promote oak resilience. Here, we're talking about stewardship, tree planting, and work in the woods. And to do that, we need to work with professional foresters and other natural resource professionals, find out what they're struggling with, and talking with them about what they need in terms of tools, resources, and information to assess oak forest health, inform the landowners that they're working with, and then be able to, to take action to address some of these challenges. In working with landowners, we found that, not all of them are, fully aware of some of the challenges facing this forest type, particularly the regeneration issue. And we want to make them aware of some of these new emerging solutions and ways of doing things. And then finally, in this small area where we have three different states, we want to foster collaboration among the three state agencies and the number of conservation organizations and nonprofits that work with landowners and other folks in the region, since there's a lot to be gained by working together on issues that are really affecting all of us in different corners of the region, rather than taking a more siloed approach when we're just looking at what's going on within our own individual states or regions. Want to underscore, the critical importance of forest landowners in this region. Many of them folks are like those whom you see in the slide here, because they are, ultimately the decision makers who will determine, whether the forest stays as forest, and how it's taken care of over the decades to come. In our work as foresters and resource professionals, we need to be able to understand where they're coming from, their goals in owning the land, in order to be able to effectively work with them and carry out some of the strategies that that we recommend. It's also important to note that within this matrix, there are certainly some important public lands, particularly state and municipal lands in southern New England. This is a schematic diagram, sums up the activities that we're undertaking in this grant, all around the central goal of increasing oak resiliency. Off to the left, we have our two-pronged approach of trying to engage, both foresters and landowners in sort of different but parallel tracks that certainly lead to bringing them in contact, interacting. I think this is the part of the grant where there's some of the more tangible products like webinars, workshops, and field tours. And then the resiliency assessment tool, which we're going to explore more soon. And then over on the right, there are also some process goals of the project, which we're trying to build a community of practice of the resource professionals working here, and then a sense of community among landowners as well. And as the project draws towards its conclusion, we're going to synthesize lessons learned, approaches that are working, and try to pay that forward into future projects, and work on the land in this region, since we know that we're not going to be able to resolve it all in the 3-year project period. Of course, most of this project has taken place during the pandemic, which has had a huge influence on the way all of us have worked. Has disrupted some of our best laid plans, but I think we've also had some successful innovations by necessity that have come out of this, and just wanted to share a couple of examples. First, going back to the winter of 2020, when we were getting underway, we hosted landowner town halls in person, actually at some of the town hall buildings in different parts of Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And that was an effective way to first start interacting with some of these landowners. But of course, it was not possible last year, but we wanted to reconnect with folks, see how they're doing, share some of the new information that we were learning. So we hosted an online town hall, and this afforded an opportunity for specialists like Service Forester Doug Hutchison there and others to really speak to their specific area of expertise, share it across state lines, and also for landowners to come together in different combinations and hear each other's questions, rather than some of the same groups of folks and friends who often see each other at tree farm or landowner organization meetings. Some new combinations. And we also had some hopes for workshops and conferences for professional development, but since we haven't been able to do that, we have developed a hybrid learning exchange model in which you might have a webinar, focusing on a particular aspect of oak resiliency, followed by a field event in which everyone comes together later to look at this in more depth. This photo is from the Oak Resiliency Learning Exchange that we hosted last fall, in which the webinar looked at both forest health research on the Quabbin Reservation in central Massachusetts, and then some of the management strategies that the landowners were undertaking to respond to some of the same issues. And then we convened on site the following week on a beautiful fall day to learn about these in more detail. And I think that this is a model that we'll be employing even after the pandemic is over, because of its utility, and just a good model for bringing people together. So at this moment, want to transition and hand it over to Maddie and Logan, who are going to take that deeper dive into the assessment tool. Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher. Yeah, that's a really, really great context on the greater Oak Resiliency Project and goals with stewarding oak in southern New England. So like Logan set up at the beginning of this workshop, we worked with the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative to develop this tool. So that's what I'm going to be doing, is providing an overview of how to use the tool. And we really started to make it super user-friendly. So I'm going to go over what is all encompassed in it, and then we'll provide an example and give you some time to test it out yourselves. So the tool is mainly designed for natural resource professionals to first assess the resiliency of a given oak stand, and then second, explore potential adaptation actions and relevant resources. So users of the tool complete an assessment of the vulnerability of a stand of their choosing, and are then provided with a report that includes an overall vulnerability rating and organizes some key considerations and resources based on their assessment. The outputs of the tool are designed to enable you to quickly and easily translate various threats and opportunities related to oak forests to private family forest owners or other partners. Again, we built this tool after an extensive literature review on oak forests in New England, along with expert consultation and that hybrid online and in-person workshop that Christopher just showed pictures from in July to get forester feedback. And then we also presented it at the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative Conference last month. So next slide, please. So the first thing that you'll do after navigating to the homepage of the tool and clicking the Start Stand Assessment button is provide some information about yourself and about the stand you have in mind, including the location and a site description. So the assessment is designed to be used at more of a stand level or for a small property or parcel, and we do recommend going through it multiple times for separate areas if you're working on a larger or more variable forest. You'll also be asked in this assessment whether you agree to allow the project team to use the information that you enter for further analysis, research, and summary statistics so that we can better understand the big picture of oak vulnerability and resilience across the landscape. Next slide. Great, so then after that information, you'll move right into the assessment, which really consists of these two key components that help us better understand the overall vulnerability of a site. So the first on the left is the potential impacts of climate change and other disturbances on the site. So with this, we're really looking at both imminent and future threats to the health and function of the forest. And then the other side to this equation is the adaptive capacity of the site. So here we're thinking about the ability of the site to cope with change. And then weighing these considerations together, we can get a better idea of the level of vulnerability of a particular stand. Next slide. So that's the big picture of determining vulnerability, but I'll get a little more specific about how we're actually assessing impacts and adaptive capacity with this tool. So this is a GIF on the right side of the screen here, so you'll see that moving around. And this is exactly what the interactive assessment looks like when you go through it. So you'll use a sliding scale to go through and rate how supportive or disruptive these 10 different anticipated changes or impacts listed on the left are for your site. There's descriptive language on each side of the scale to help you appropriately rate your site. So for example, for the impact of extreme precipitation events, the low end of the scale says heavier rain events will not greatly impact the site due to gentle topography and or well-drained soils. And then the high end of the scale says heavier rain events will greatly impact the site and lead to erosion on steep slopes and flooding in low-lying areas. Another feature that you can use to decide how to rate yourself on these impacts is these small blue icons on the right of each impact that can be clicked on for some more information. So then after rating the stand on those 10 impacts, you'll give yourself an overall impact rating based on what you surmised from going through the other questions. And then you'll move into the adaptive capacity assessment. So you'll use a similar sliding scale, but this time to rate these various site characteristics that contribute to an ecosystem's ability to cope with and adapt to changing conditions and disturbances. So whereas a high rating on the impacts assessment was a negative thing, a high rating for these factors is favorable and will contribute to a reduced overall vulnerability score. So for example, for the level of landscape connectivity, the low end of the scale says the site is small and isolated or surrounded by agricultural or developed lands. And then the high end of the scale says the site is part of a large complex of forests or other ecosystems. And then again, after considering these characteristics, you'll give your stand an overall adaptive capacity rating. Next slide. Great, so that's the assessment. And then after doing all that good thinking comprehensively about your stand, you'll be presented with this results summary page. So the combination of the two overall ratings you gave yourself from impacts and adaptive capacity produce a final vulnerability rating, which in this example case was moderate. And then you can see that your answers also place you within this matrix that gives you a more nuanced sense of that result. The ratings of the other individual components in the assessment inform which of these issues of concern appear on the results page. And then those you can see on the right bottom side of the results page. You can click on each of those issues of concern and they'll bring you to an interactive page with some more information, including potential adaptation approaches, relevant resources, ideas related to monitoring, as well as on-the-ground examples from other land managers in New England who have projects where they are specifically addressing those concerns. All right, and then if you scroll further down the results page, you'll see a range of adaptation pathways presented, including resistance, resilience, transition, and no action. So if you click on any one of these, you'll access another interactive page with an overall conceptual description of that pathway, along with a table of potential adaptation actions based on site condition descriptions. And these example adaptation actions included in the pathways are largely based off of a resource created by the Northern Institute of Applied Science called Adaptation Menus. And so those are a culmination of extensive review of the scientific literature, as well as a synthesis of ideas and experiences provided by land managers on adaptation actions. So there is some guidance when you expand each of these pathways on whether or not it's the right pathway for you. So for instance, if you go through the assessment and you find that your stand is low vulnerability, it may be relatively easy to maintain the current forest condition by leaving things relatively unmanaged or implementing some measures to resist disturbance and change. But if you got a more moderate or high vulnerability result, those resistance and no action pathways are likely to be less feasible and potentially more challenging. And some of the approaches in the resilience or transition pathways may be more appropriate. And lastly, it's important to note that the content in these adaptation pathways should not really be considered to be recommendations or prescriptions, but rather options for you to consider when making decisions within your specific management context. So more of a decision support tool, less of a decision-making tool. And then lastly, all of the information from the results page, including those issues of concern and adaptation pathways, are bundled up into a downloadable PDF report. So that's something that's really handy and can be used to inform and attach to management plans or reference in conversations with landowners. So that's the overview of the tool. And now we're going to share a brief example from the Rhode Island Forest Conservators Organization who use the tool before you all get a chance to visit the website and try it out yourself.
Thanks, Maddie. And as she just mentioned, this is an example from the Rhode Island Forest Conservators Organization. And we're working with a student at the University of Connecticut who's developing a story map for this project. And they are going, they've met with landowners in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And this is their example that they've developed for the Rhode Island portion of their project. And so I'm going to ask Christopher, who's familiar with the property, to talk a little bit about the assessment impacts and assessment of the adaptive capacity at the property.
Thanks, Logan. So the Rifco woodlot, as it's known, is located in Foster, Rhode Island, quite near the border with Connecticut, well inland. And, this is an example of a property that's, quite typical of others that you might find, particularly in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and I think Eastern Massachusetts. It's about 40 acres in size. And Rifco, as a landowner organization, manages this property in a way that is intended to approximate what some of the private landowners or families whom I was talking about earlier might actually do on their land. It's relatively flat, dominated by oak and hardwood forest, with other species mixed in, certainly. And as you can see from the assessment, it impacts here. It's doing pretty well in many areas. Though you'll note that it's highly affected by white-tailed deer and their impacts on the regeneration on the property. That really shows up and is something that Rifco is trying to address. They're also dealing with some invasive plant issues in different areas of the property. And that's another notable impact that I'm sure is familiar to many of you participating today. We can go on to the next slide and take a look at the adaptive capacity of the property. And that's, somewhat, impacted or, limited by the long, history of land use on this property from, I'm sure, pre-colonial times to, being intensively managed and farmed, during the agricultural era, and then managed as a woodlot in the more recent history, continuing up until the present. And again, you can see the regeneration and ability to regenerate showing up here in the regeneration potential being somewhat low. And one of the ways that Rifco is trying to address this is they've created a demonstration slash wall on the property, around a harvest area to try to protect that area inside on the other side of the slash there from deer being able to get in and eat the regeneration. And there's right next to it, there's another area which has had the same silvicultural treatment, but it's not fenced like that, so you can directly compare the results. And this property has it's quite actively managed. They've also incorporated some of the forestry for the birds principles into a thinning on another part of this property, and you can go out there and you can see the results of different silvicultural treatments over time. So overall an adaptive capacity somewhat high, but some of those significant impacts from factors that I tried to highlight.
Great, thanks, Christopher. And as we look at the report summary, we get a score, vulnerability rating of moderate. And as we look at the graph that shows, and as we look at the graph, you can see we plot over 3 was the impact score and 4 was the adaptive capacity score. So 3 over 4 up. And then the issues of concerns are highlighted here, including invasive species management, herbivory, competition, drought, and pests and pathogens. And I guess my question for Christopher is this what you'd expect to see for this woodlot?
Well, look, I think it is. Certainly having had the benefit of, spending some time on this property, the herbivory and invasive species are two that, jumped out to me, with my forester's eye. I think we're tuned to, look at pests and pathogens as well. But drought is another one that, I might, having not, looked at a soil map or right off the bat, but I know that in the decades to come, when we're, anticipating, warmer temperatures, greater intervals in between rainfall, I could see that becoming exacerbated. And, it's also has, pointed out the issue of competition for more shade tolerant species that I think something that the foresters in this region, some of us could stand to pay a bit more attention to, and this brings it out.
Great, thanks for that overview, Christopher. It's really helpful to have your perspective as somebody who's been at the property and worked with the owners enough to know what's going on there. So now is your chance to test the tool. We'll provide a link in the chat window in just a moment. But this is your opportunity to familiarize yourself with the tool. You can access the tool in the link. You'll have around 15 minutes of silent working time, and Maddie, Christopher, and I are on standby if you have any questions. Just feel free to unmute yourself and ask, and we'll do our best to help. You can also use the chat window to list your questions there. I do invite anyone who is able to turn on their cameras. The next portion of this workshop is really an open discussion about the tool. And as we kind of get oriented, I'm going to ask Maddie if she can launch the last poll that we have, which asks the questions: how did the tool work for you, and were the outputs in line with what you expected? So thanks to everyone who participated in the poll. We're sharing the results now. So for half of you, it worked excellent, and the other half, good, but you still have questions. And then were the tool outputs in line with what you expect? 3 out of 8 said yes, and 5 out of 8 said almost. And so if you said good, but I still have questions and almost, I really want to hear from you in this next discussion portion. So looking at the first questions, how did the tool work for you? Cindy, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think it worked pretty well. The parcel that we're looking at actually was heavily damaged by gypsy moths, and we actually did some timber salvage there earlier this year. So most of the oaks are gone at this point. There's very heavy deer damage in that area, but most of what is coming back as seedlings are oaks. So we're trying to figure out how best to manage that. And I think this is going to be very helpful in figuring that out.
Great, thanks for that. And were the outputs in line with what you expected?
Yeah, well, what came out is unknown vulnerability, which
okay.
I'm kind of not surprised. I mean, I was hoping for, something a little more concise, but I'm not surprised.
Okay, that's very helpful to know. And when you're doing the tool, it's really essential to click that overall box at the end, and that might have been what happened there. So if you run the tool again, that's something to look for. But we're happy to work with you as well. And 1 second, there we go. Great, thank you, Cindy. We appreciate it. Is it Tom or Brad? I see your cameras are on. Do you want to answer how the tool worked for you, and were the inputs, the outputs what you expected?
Yeah, I appreciated the tool because I saw it as a really good way to kind of think through things. It's kind of like, when you're in a forest and you're looking at it, you can kind of come up with ideas, but then when you look at the data, that really opens up a whole new picture for it. And it was interesting because somebody presented it about that it's really not like to tell you exactly the X, Y, and Z for management, but it's a decision support tool. So it's all those good steps that start keying your mind in to thinking about, oh, I didn't really think about this, or these options that are now laid out in me that I can actually assess and think about and actually dive deeper into it. I mean, the number of resources that are referenced in the reports that come in there is amazing. I mean, in the like 20 minutes I looked through things, I was able to click on research papers and a whole bunch of other things to be able to take a deeper dive if that's what you wanted to do into it. So, I knew the site that I looked at was probably going to be low vulnerability. One thing that I did find a little bit, because the site would be potentially prone to gypsy moth defoliation in there. And so I know one tactic that I'm looking at is like retaining way more oak than I normally would, with the anticipation that it's going to come through and I'm going to have some mortality later on down the line. But it is a lot, but I did think that it was not only a good decision tool, but like if I work on state lands, but if I was working with a private landowner, it really brings up a lot of things as a communication tool too, to be able to point out things to talk to a landowner about. So it is a lot, but I rather have, in my opinion, I'd rather have more than less. So I found it very helpful.
Thanks for that overview. I appreciate it. And I think that you hit the nail on the head with the communication tool aspect of it. Is something that you can use with landowners. And we'll get into more of that as we look ahead towards the end. And then the other thing that jumped out at me is a decision support making tool. It's not a prescriptive tool as this is what you should do, but these are the options that are laid out for you. So I appreciate that. Does anyone else want to share what they thought? So how'd the tool work for you? Were the outputs in line with what you expected? And what would you need to use the tool in your day-to-day work?
This is Brad. So to be clear, I'm not in Southern New England or even New England. So I'm in Wisconsin. So I'm just fascinated because I think this is really a cool approach. But is there a way, it feels to me, so I got the report and I ran it on some sample data, but it looks like the report is really long. So you're giving options for resistance, resilience, transition, and do nothing. So is there a way to throw priorities into that? Because I think what could happen is that you're going to have a forester or a landowner that says, I'd love to do something, but how do I pick? How do I choose? You've given me the options, but how do I narrow that down in order to make the best assessment? So that was one, and that was one thing. The other one would just be, maybe that would be a way forward, would be include like land management goals, so that you could have, you'd be able to kind of narrow that down a little bit if you knew that timber management was like high on the table, or aesthetics were high on the table, or there was a combination of things. But overall, I was very impressed.
Great, thanks, Brad. I see Christopher raised his hand, and Maddie has something to say. I just want to say Maddie's in Michigan, so it's not that far from you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. That's really good feedback, and I think in some ways, like we could only bite off so much with like making this tool like the perfect fit, and that report is really long. So I think like one of the ways to make it a little more bite-sized, first of all, is like interacting with the clickable pages. Because some of those, there's some intro language and you can make like the drop-down menu. So then you can kind of collapse and expand things that I think maybe is a little more user-friendly than like, yeah, that big dump of information in the report. But then in terms of like integrating management goals and objectives, totally awesome point. That's pretty much what we start with at NIAX with our adaptation workbook process, which is like, we have this 5-step adaptation workbook process, and this is looking at kind of like step 4, which is like just that peek into adaptation actions. But really, we want to encourage people, if you are working on bigger properties, especially, to make sure you're rooting in that foundation of what your management goals and objectives are. So one of the things about this tool is that it does link out on those adaptation pathways pages to our NIAX adaptation menus. So that's just another way for people to go down the rabbit hole, I guess. And you can also find resources related to the Midwest and the Northwoods as well.
Just wanted to speak to the adaptation approaches and which pathway you might take. I think the graph that's generated and you're presented with the results of the assessment, may inform, which path you take I think if the property sort of falls in the green part of the chart, with, high adaptive capacity, relatively low impacts, you're most likely going to be, better suited, to a resistance approach, there, than in the over on the other side in the, the red corner, where you have, high impacts and low adaptive capacity, that might in some cases suggest that it's could be, worthy of considering a transition approach. And then of course the overall resiliency area in between. And of course, you need to take in mind too, that's the type and size of the property or land base that you're working on. If it's a large property, one could consider, running the tool in several areas, and that could help, prioritize management, or where you focus activities during the next management plan period, say.
Mm-hmm. I didn't get a chance to look too deep into the report, but how did you guys deal with assisted migration?
Well, again, the tool, its intention is not to be prescriptive. So it doesn't make, concrete suggestions, one way or the other on that. So that's, certainly in the transition realm. And if your, property is, turning up in that corner of the graph, I think, that will, be flagged as an issue that you might consider. But I don't, think that any, trained, forester or land manager, you won't really look into that without, careful, consideration and, weighing the risks and the rewards.
Yeah, I guess to add on to that too, Brad, that assisted migration actions are included in the transition pathway, so they're built into that table. But there's and then there's also within some of the issues of concern pages, you might not have gotten as far as like getting down to the bottom of some of those pages, but we also have some adaptation demonstration projects that are linked to. So specific sites where people maybe are doing more resistance actions or are doing some transition actions such as assisted migration. So the more you explore around, the more you might find on that.
Yeah, I know you guys don't want to make this prescriptive, but I could see a real future for something like this with, just today I was looking at the SFI forest management standard enhancements. And I think number 9 in there is climate smart forestry. And it's going to basically charge us all with saying, okay, now that you're doing this, how does this relate to climate smart forestry? And so a tool like this would at least allow you to identify those options. I think that next step is, okay, how do we determine whether your option was sufficient or not? Right? Like if you identify 100 options that are great and you took this one, how do I know that was actually like climate smart or just an option that you saw on the list kind of thing? But I think this kind of approach is really useful.
Yeah, thank you so much for the feedback, Brad. We really appreciate it, and we'll take it into consideration as we continue to get the tool out there. We might have time for one more, and I saw Steve Olson turned his camera on, so I was wondering if you wanted to answer the question. How'd the tool work for you? Were the outputs in line with what you expect, and what would you need to use in your day-to-day work?
It worked for me. I guess somewhat subjective. I'd like to be able to dump some data into it to like what do you have for and conditions are. I kind of did that in the description, but that doesn't, I don't know if that really shows up in the tool. I'm also not from New England. I'm from northern Minnesota, very east. We're probably 80% aspen in our uplands. The landowners I'm working with, their goals are, a lot of them are wildlife. And oak really lends itself well to wildlife goals. But at the same time, it's also probably helping meet some climate goals. We have oak stands like you do there in New England. And a little further south from me, we've got some pretty nice oak stands. We're got the prairie, and it's got the central hardwoods and the boreal forest, and we're kind of where I'm located is kind of at the edge of the boreal forest, or where the big woods in the boreal forest. So, and trying to get, I know that this is what somewhat prescriptive, but getting aspen, getting oak to grow through aspen regen is important.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for providing that background. And as we're running short on time, I'm going to share my screen again and try to get us out as close to the top of the hour as possible. So looking to the future, what can we do with this tool? So first, forester efficiency is key here. It's great for an initial rapid assessment of a forest. The first time you go, you can use it with the client that you're working with and use it as the communication tool with the landowner. And you can do a couple birds in the same go there. And then the report at the end is a management plan addendum that you can just attach right to the management plan for the property. So that's how we want to increase forester efficiency through using the tool. And then looking at resiliency across the landscape. The data on vulnerability throughout Southern New England and beyond, we have people from all over the country on this call, will really give us a good spatial picture of what vulnerability looks like, kind of on the micro region of Southern New England, and then broader beyond that throughout the Northeast and Northern forests. And then identify areas with higher vulnerability. We can use the tool outputs in a geospatial way to see where oak is really vulnerable, and we can start to allocate resources that way. So with that, we appreciate your time. Feel free to reach out to any of us with questions. I'm going to put in the chat some links, one to the tool, one to the additional resources page hosted by the Forest Stewards Guild. And then if you need CFE credits, you can email me. A big shout out to Christopher Riley and Maddie Baroli for joining me on this presentation workshop. And then, of course, you can keep up with us on these social media platforms. We'd really like to stay in touch with you. And if you use the tool, let us know how it works for you and if you've used it with clients. Any information we get will only inform the use of the tool in the future. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. It's great to have you all
Thanks.
here today.